What's going on, guys? So what happens when a mathematician, a biologist, and a scientist, who are all strong believers of God, discuss the evidence for God and evolution? You get 10 minutes of phenomenal discussion and a complete annihilation of evolution. Michael Behe, Stephen Meyer, and John Lennox are, in my opinion, some of the heavy hitters of the Christian space, not only in apologetics, but just their understanding of science. And this discussion, which I'm just going to show you a segment of it, is, in my opinion, some of the best information about creation, God, and how evolution is completely washed up, right? So they discuss, using Darwin's own words, some of the major flaws of evolution. I'm going to play this whole segment. I want you to stick around because I'm going to give some of my thoughts at the end, but I really hope this video encourages you. Check it out.
Two quotations, Michael, two quotations. Charles Darwin in The Origin. If Darwin himself writes this, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, close quote. That's Darwin. He puts the test right there in 1859. Here's Michael Behe. The question then becomes, are there irreducibly complex systems in the cell? Yes, there are many.
Absolutely. As I said, the cell is chock full of machines. Machines need many parts. They can't be built by numerous successive slight modifications. But let me draw attention to one little sneaky trick that Darwin put into that quotation. He says, if it could be demonstrated that something couldn't possibly happen. Right. So he's putting a burden on his opponents to prove a negative, which science cannot do and never has. No theory has ruled out all rival theories to be accepted. But we have great evidence and that it can't, and we have absolutely no evidence that natural selection acting on random mutation could build much of anything.
So here's the objection. The objection. I say this as if I know enough to be authoritative. Here's an objection. And the objection runs, all right, it's very hard to see how you evolve a mousetrap beginning with a little wooden platform. And true, it can't work until all the pieces are in place. On the other hand, suppose you do evolve it in 2 or 3 pieces and they sit around for centuries. They don't confer any advantage on the organism, but they don't harm it either. So they're these strange accretions on which natural selection is neutral. It doesn't select for them, but it doesn't select against them. And then after eons and eons, we worry about the maths later, after eons and eons, the final piece drops into place and suddenly it functions. Plausible?
No, that's ridiculous. I mean, realistically, would you...
He's being very careful with Darwin, but he's swatting me aside. Right, go ahead.
No, if you think, suppose you didn't have a mousetrap. So you say, well, what can I do? I'll just go into my garage and pick out a few pieces that would function as a mousetrap. And you say, well, I need a spring. Well, here's one in this grandfather clock I have. You wind up, I'll just use that. And I need a hammer to squash the mouse. I'll use this crowbar over here. But the pieces aren't adjusted to each other. You can't just take random pieces and put them together. And natural selection, which, as Darwin said, is constantly scrutinizing life, would not be expected to make things in the shape that they would need to be for some future use. They would they would hone them for what they were doing right now.
All right.
Can I weigh in on
Sure,
this?
of
Because
course.
there's a connection between what Mike's talking about and the mathematical problems that John was alluding to. And that is that in these actual systems, these nanomachines that Mike has made famous through his work, for example, the bacterial flagellar motor or the ATP synthase, one's a rotary...
This man has made the flagellar motor a rock star.
Well, he kind of has. He kind of has. But it's a 30-part rotary engine. The ATP synthase is a turbine with multiple parts. But the parts are made of proteins. And proteins are in essence, the toolbox of the cell. They perform specific functions in view of their 3-dimensional shapes. So they make the parts of molecular machines. They function as enzymes to catalyze reactions at super fast rates. They help process information. But if you were to build a system like the flagellar motor, you need 30 proteins that fit together in an integrated fashion. But that requires genetic code. Each one of those proteins requires a long stretch of genetic information to build the protein. And so what you're talking about is not just, some bent hammer or something sitting around doing nothing. You're talking about a need for genetic information that is sufficient to overcome these long odds against building the protein in the first place. So it'd be like, to change the metaphor slightly, a gigantic haystack the size of the North American continent, and you're only allowed to search 1/1037th of the continent, maybe a tiny little square of Southern California. If that's the case, are you more likely or less likely to
find the needle?
To find the needle? And the answer is you're overwhelmingly more likely not to find the needle than to find it, which is to say the mutation selection mechanism lacks the creative power to generate new biological information.
Close to the creative.
Exactly, and that's for one protein.
One protein out of 13 proteins necessary to make the waving little tail, which is only one machine. All right.
Yeah.
And that, in a sense, is before you said anything about the fact that the information required is linguistic. And linguistic language is not produced by random processes.
Right.
And this is
Listen to this.
hugely
You've got to
important
explain
thing.
what you mean.
Well,
Listen to this.
It's
take the-
linguistic in the way the
take
DNA...
the human genome.
Code.
Exactly, yes.
Code, all
The
right.
human genome is the longest word we've ever discovered. And we can call it a word because it's written in a chemical language of 4 letters. And all those letters, strung out like a computer program, have got to be in the right order, otherwise it breaks down. I mean, most programs, if you change a letter, that's the end of the program. So we're dealing with something absolutely gigantic in terms of probabilities before we even think of the extra complexity that arises through the folding of the proteins and all the epigenetic information that's been discovered in recent years.
That's
then
information beyond DNA that controls how the
becomes
lower level information is used.
bewildering
Yeah.
in its complexity. And therefore it becomes a huge stress. And my own simplistic view is to say I prefer an explanation that makes sense to one that doesn't make sense.
There it
If I
is.
could add just a little something, we're talking about this ultra-complex machine, the bacterial flagellum, and saying that what Darwinian processes are laughably inadequate to explain it. But I want to point out that it can explain things a whole lot more simple than a bacterial flagellum. We talked about how many amino acids these things have, and there's 30 proteins and 400 amino acids, and so 12,000-ish or so. But in order to develop resistance to the anti-malarial drug chloroquine, it took trillions and trillions of malarial cells, Plasmodium falciparum, to get 2 crummy mutations. 2, and we're talking about 12,000 for the flagellum. Now, trillions, and for each extra mutation, it goes up exponentially. That, Steve was talking in exponential language, but that's another factor of a trillion for another one, and another factor of a trillion for the next one too. So this is truly, even much simpler things than we've been talking about are beyond Darwinian processes. I just want to add one little cute thing is that these days scientists can do evolution in the laboratory, grow bacterial cultures and for a long time and see what happens. And a man named Richard Lennox, a biologist at Michigan, did this for a bacterium called E. coli. And one of the first mutations that he saw that really helped the bacteria grow faster was when it deleted the genes, got rid of the genes for the bacterial
Instead of adding information,
flagellum.
it's dropping it.
Exactly, and that's something we haven't touched on yet, but it's oftentimes a whole lot faster and easier to get rid of stuff and to improve a species' chance to survive and prosper than to
But you
build
can't
stuff.
get a new species by dropping out information, by becoming
That's-
stupider.
That's
But
correct.
adding new capabilities requires new proteins, which requires solving this combinatorial problem, this search for those exceedingly rare sequences among the vast number of gibberish sequences that don't do anything useful.
Little
So
parenthetical.
again, you're back to the needle in the haystack problem.
These three men clearly know what they're talking about. I love the fact that they didn't castigate, atheists, or, they didn't say anything bad about evolutionists. They just simply pointed to the fact that Darwin's theory is anemic when it comes to explaining very complex things like the cell. When we look at things with our scientific instrumentation, whether it be a telescope or a microscope, it's like the deeper we look into space, the more complex it becomes, the more fine-tuned it becomes. And when we look deeper into the cells, the more complex they become. And Darwin didn't have this capability, this access in the 1800s. He didn't have high-power microscopes to see the complexity of the cell. But the deeper we use our scientific instrumentation, the more it points to God, the more it points to the fingerprint of God, that these things are designed. And there's no counter arguments to nothing they discuss. They have even discussed some of the objections, and they kind of answered those in the whole long form video, but there's no arguments. What atheists and evolutionists will typically do, they will just resort to ad hominem attacks, to attack the people, to attack their degrees or their education, and say, well, the education is not valid because they don't believe in evolution, or they appeal to authority, that there are so many other scientists who believe in the delusion of evolution, and that these guys are somewhat discredited. Or they would do the special pleading fallacy, where they just say, well, instead of addressing these claims and arguments, they would just say, well, there's no evidence for God in the first place, so let's just discard this stuff and let's just attack the point that there's no evidence for a God. They won't even try to attack these arguments because they cannot be attacked. These are scientists. These guys know this information, and they are very well versed in depth in what they understand. Honestly, there is no true atheist. To be a true atheist, you have to know with absolute certainty that there is no God anywhere in the universe. And if you claim to know that there is no God anywhere in the universe, that would make you omniscient, that would make you God, and you would just defeat the purpose of saying there is no God, because you would be God. But we know there's no human being that knows all things. So there is, even an atheist must concede the fact that there is a possibility that God exists somewhere in the deepest part of the universe that they don't know anything about. So at best, there are only agnostics in the world. No one can say there is no God with absolute certainty. They can't say that. But atheists will say, well, I lack a belief in God. I don't want to make a claim. I just lack a belief. Well, guess what? A tree lacks a belief in God, but a tree doesn't have a brain. A tree doesn't make claims about the origin of the universe or the purpose and meaning of life. Trees don't do that. Humans do. So to say there's a lack of belief is just a cop-out. The reality is, it's intellectually dishonest. It is. So there are no atheists. There are only agnostics. And if there's only agnostics, then we must address the claim of knowledge. You don't know there's a God. And once you stay there, then we can start discussing the evidence for God by looking and watching this great discussion with these three powerhouses of science: John Lennox, Stephen Meyer, and Michael Behe. If you want to watch this whole video, I linked it in the description. This video brought so much encouragement to me, and I'm a lot smarter as a result of watching this video. So if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to this channel and like this video. I'll be back next week with another one. This is Pastor Frederick. This is About a Book. Peace.